Welcome back to Inclusive Design 2024, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Barrier Break and Intopia, and our Gold supporters, Barrier Break, Infoaxia, and Tetralogical. You can follow us on Mastodon, Blue Sky, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And if you have questions for the presenters, please post them using the ID24 hashtag. You can also post your questions in our YouTube chat. We'll gather your questions for the Q&A at the end of the session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. I am happy to be joined again by my guest host, Bruce Lawson. Over to you, Bruce.
I'm happy to be here, Kathleen. Thank you. But it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce to you Wilco Fiers, who is going to tell us about accessibility beyond WCAG, and I confess now I do have to check my notes, EAA and EN 301549. Take it away, Wilco.
Thank you so much. You don't have those numbers in your head just yet?
Right.
Don't worry, you will. Let me screen share. Here we go. Very good. So thanks, everybody. Wilco Fiers. I'm a product owner at Deque Systems. I am responsible, among other things, for Axe Core. So I'd like to say that if you find any false positives, that's my fault. So sorry about that, but please come tell me about it. And today, what I'd like to talk to you about is accessibility beyond WCAG. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines has been a great standard for us, but there is a good deal more on the horizon. Namely, the European Accessibility Act introduces a number of new things, and as part of that, EN 301549. So I'll tell you all about that today. For short, so today what we'll be looking at is a European Accessibility Act. What is it for? Who does it apply to? It's the newest directive coming from the European Union, and it has some serious implications all around the world. The standard that kind of goes with that, EN 301549, again, what's in it? What is it exactly? And then there are some additional things in European Accessibility Act, or EAA, as we like to say, that even go beyond 301549. So there's new requirements in accessibility coming to you soon. So let's get started on the European Accessibility Act. Just a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. So make sure to double check before you act. So the European Accessibility Act is what's called a directive of the European Union. And a directive, what that is a kind of a decree from the EU that then every country within the EU incorporates into law. So this is affecting the 27 member states of the EU, along with a number of countries that follow the EU but aren't necessarily a member. And the European Accessibility Act, what it brings to the table is primarily its goal is to ensure equality across equal access for all Europeans when it comes to digital and ICT technologies. It's a harmonization act, which means that it harmonizes different accessibility laws that currently exist within different countries. And that's a very European thing to do. That's what the EU is all about. It's harmonization. It is making sure that the laws in different countries are the same, so that when an organization working in one country can easily do the same work in another without needing to change how they operate because of different legislation. The other part to that is that it exists to promote a single market. Right now, the way much of EU web accessibility in particular, but broader accessibility too, works is that you've got lots of smaller organizations within each country doing work within that country, but they don't go across borders much. And part of that is because the legislation and the requirements are different in different places. And so what the EU hopes to do is build out a single market with large organizations working across Europe and get that economy of scale going, add more competition, better products, better services come out of that. And the European Accessibility Act, specifically what it then applies to is products and services sold across the EU. So let's dig into that a little bit. What are those services? So specifically, there's 6 categories. There is e-commerce services. So think your web shops, think your e-learning services, those kinds of environments. There's banking services, audiovisual media services. So think your televisions, your Netflixes, your online media platforms. YouTube probably applies to that too, because they have a service that you can buy from them, right? There's communication services such as email services, telecommunication services, those kinds of things, ebooks, and then various aspects of transport services. So bus transport, train transport, air transport, those kinds of things have digital components to them, and the EAA applies to those. On the products that fall under the European Accessibility Act, there are consumer electronics, things like laptops, tablets, desktop computers, smartphones, smartwatches, VR headsets, those kinds of consumer electronic devices. Then there's terminals for things like payments, ticketing, self-service, TVs, and the kinds of things you wire up to them, basically. So your set-top boxes, your gaming consoles, those kinds of things. You've got e-readers. And then for all of those, operating systems are considered part of those products. So those fall under the EAA as well. So who does it apply to? So you might think, okay, I'm not based in Europe. What do I care? That's not how it works. Providers based in the EU certainly applies to those, but also anybody bringing services and products to the EU market, it applies to you as well. If you're part of a supply chain, so if you have a reseller in Europe, you're part of this. This applies to you. Even the broader scope of products, things like help desks and support, things like documentation, that's all part of the European Accessibility Act. So this is a very broad new laws that apply throughout all of Europe that has implications for the entire supply chain, which exists across the planet. There are some exceptions to the European Accessibility Act. They are not as worth mentioning, but they come up super regularly, so I did want to touch on them. There is the very kind of well-known disproportionate burden exception, which what it comes down to is if the EAA asks for something that is unreasonable, you can opt out. That is a reason not to conform to some of these accessibility requirements. However, and this is kind of a big one, it's not a broad exemption. It's you cannot, for example, say my entire app is just disproportionate burden. We didn't have the means, it was too old, we couldn't afford it, we didn't know how to do it. None of that applies. There might be parts of an application or a website or a product that you couldn't make work because doing so would have been just unreasonable, but you can't just say the whole thing is out of scope. That's not how it works. And even narrower than that, when you have that part that you think might not be reasonable to make that accessible, you have to then narrow it down to not just all requirements don't apply. You have to figure out, okay, what can we reasonably do and what can't we do? So some of the requirements you can say there's a limited set we're not applying, but you can't just say, no, we'll just not cover accessibility in this piece or that piece at all. It's not how it works. And then what makes that even slightly more trickier yet is that there's going to be surveillance authorities in different countries. So every EU country is going to have one or more surveillance authorities, and each of them is going to assess whether the disproportionate burden you might be claiming or an organization might be claiming, whether that's appropriate. So there's going to be 27 evaluations if you distribute in 27 countries of whether that or not that was a good call. So there's a good chance that it might not pass. So that's a fair warning and a heads up to everybody who's thinking that direction. The other exception is there, well, major exception, there's a couple smaller ones, is for micro enterprises, and specifically micro enterprises that create products in the EU market. And those are defined as organizations that have fewer than 10 employees and fewer than 2 million in revenue. There's an exception for that. Some important dates to be aware of. The big one is June 28th, 2025. New products have to comply to EAA by that date, and services signed after that date as well. So if you've got an existing contract to offer a certain service, no, but a contract's agreed on after that, yes, EAA applies to that. Once it hits June 30th, 2030, it's across the board, all products and services. There's one exception for terminals, which because terminals are built in an environment, they are presumed to maybe be lasting for like a terminal. The lifetime of a terminal can be up to 25 years, which is why there is this long timeline for that. But as soon as you decide to replace a terminal, the new one needs to comply to these new requirements as well. And for these last two, there is a clause in the European Accessibility Act which says that countries are allowed to shorten that timeline as well. Then on enforcement, because of course, countries, as I mentioned already, they're going to appoint their own surveillance authorities. These are likely existing surveillance authorities. In most places, what we're seeing is different industries already have their surveillance authorities, and these are generally being appointed the role of having to do the surveillance on the EAA as well. Consumers may take legal actions if a service or a product does not comply to the European Accessibility Act, and non-compliance may result in fines, and they may result in fines in different countries. So you might have, if in a worst case scenario, you may end up getting fined in 27 different countries for not complying to this one European Accessibility Act. And then for products, there's what's called a CE mark. This is a mark that products sold in the European market have to have, and compliance to EAA is required for you to get that that CE mark. And so products may have to be pulled off the market if they do not comply to the European Accessibility Act. So this is a pretty darn serious measure that's coming here. On to my next topic, 301-549. So unlike the previous one, which was a directive, EN 301-549 is a standard. And the difference there is directives are used in laws, and then standards are kind of the rules that are applied by that are set by the laws. So EN 301-549 really is the thing to look at when it comes to, okay, we've talked about what things need to be accessible. Now let's talk about what it means for those to be accessible. 301-549 is a harmonized European standard. It's developed by a number of European standards bodies. So it's ETSI, SEN, and SENELEC. So this compared to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is developed by the W3C, which is an international standards organization. However, EN 301-549 has a lot to thank from WCAG. WCAG it makes up a good part of 301-549, namely all of WCAG 2.1, level A and AA is included in 301-549. However, unlike WCAG, which is written specifically for web technologies, 301-549 is applied to non-web software, to hardware, I'll get into more detail what else is there. And it includes extra requirements, including for web. So there are requirements in 301.549 that if you're conforming the WCAG already, you might not conform to. So it goes beyond what WCAG has covered. And for many organizations, there are new things to learn. So specifically what's in scope, what I'd like to do there is the best thing I found in 301.549 is a table of contents, which really clearly lays out what's in scope there. It starts in chapter 6, ICT for two-way voice communication, which can be software, it can be web, it can be hardware. ICT for video capabilities. There's hardware. There's chapter 9 is web, but then you've got non-web documents. So your Office formats. You've got software. And then there is documentation and support services. So it's not just the hardware and the software itself, it's the documentation that comes with it that has accessibility requirements written around it. So it's really broad in terms of what's covered by that. And that's one of the reasons why 301.549 is also really starting to see some adoption outside of the EU as well. Australia, I think, was one of the first to do it. In Australia, they've adopted 301.549 as an Australian standard. Canada more recently has done the same. It's also being used by the governments in Japan, in India, and in Kenya. So we're really starting to see this standard take off. So it's building on top of this web content accessibility standard that we've been using for several decades at this point. And building beyond that by expanding the scope to hardware, to other types of software, to documents more generally, and then adding additional requirements on top of that. So let's look a little bit more closely at what some of those new requirements are. And what I'm giving here is just a shortened list of the things that I personally found most interesting to talk about, but there's a good deal more of this too. So I would recommend if this applies to you, if this is interesting to you, go have a read. This is pretty interesting. The first one to talk about, and I've shortened the text a little bit, is section 5.2. This is general. This applies to everything. Activation of accessibility features. The requirement here is documented accessibility features must be accessible to those the features were designed to help. So basically what that comes down to, if you've designed an accessibility feature, if it's in your products, then you have to document and you have to make sure that people that need it can actually use it. And this applies not just to features that are required by the standard itself, but to additional features as well. So things like a contrast change, even if your default contrast is sufficient to meet the requirements, if you build in some kind of contrast change or color scheme, you need to make sure that that feature is accessible to the people that need it. In-page text resizing is another thing. Lots of websites have the little plusy, zoomy icons in their top right. Make sure those are accessible to people that need it. And another thing you see fairly commonly is a read aloud functionality, and those aren't necessarily always accessible either. And unlike the web content accessibility guides, which kind of go, well, if the page is accessible, then it's maybe okay for this not to be. Here, 301.549 is explicitly saying this is part of, and you have to make sure that if you offer it, that it's accessible. The next one on my list, biometrics. This is another in the general category. Do not rely on biological characteristics alone for authentication or control of ICT. Little bit of a complicated sentence, but it comes down to if you're doing things like authenticate with a fingerprint like you've got on a phone, or facial recognition like many laptops have built into them these days, or eye tracking if you're doing some more advanced stuff. If you're using technologies like that for control or for authentication, then there has to be a way to authenticate or control that system without those relying on those biological characteristics. And here too, this can easily apply to web. These things are available for web. There's early days for biometrics on web, but the technology is coming online, and mobile apps have had this for a while now too. So it really adds new things on top of the existing accessibility standards. 6211, real-time text. And this is in the two-way voice communication kind of side of things. ICT with two-way voice shall provide two-way real-time text. And real-time text you might not be entirely familiar with. So real-time text, what it is the ability to send messages as you type them. This is something that captioners often use in captioning videos, but it's not as common in consumer communication, where you got a chat feature that you type a message, and once you press the enter key, you click your submit button, it goes out. So what this expects for all of those consumer communications, there at least has to be the option for real-time text communication. So existing chat features on applications that do voice communication probably need to be updated because of this requirement as well. Spoken subtitles, another very interesting one. This one falls under the video capabilities one. Video with audio allows captions to be spoken, except where captions are not programmatic. What that comes down to is when you've got a video with closed captions, these are captions that you can turn on and off. There's kind of two ways to do this. Either you have to provide spoken captions as a separate audio track. That's a technology that you can sometimes see on the web in places. Or if you don't provide that, then you need to enable something like a screen reader to be able to read those captions. This is especially useful for translations, but it can also be for translate when the captions translate the speaker, but there's other use cases for this as well. What this doesn't apply to is open captions when the text is part of the video and cannot be taken out of it. So that's the programmatic part of this requirement. On to my next one, controls for captions and for audio description. I had to shorten AD audio description a little bit. This again is video capabilities, and for video with audio, the control to activate subtitles and audio descriptions are at the same interaction level as primary controls. What that requirement comes down to is when you've got audio description and captions, captions at the least is required, and audio descriptions are required if you don't have a transcript. If you have one of those, the controls to activate and deactivate them have to be at the same sort of place or the same level of interaction as the play, pause, and stop controls. So you cannot just hide these controls in a submenu somewhere. They have to be easily available and findable to people. And this doesn't mean that these controls need to be permanently visible. If your play controls hide, then like on a full screen mode, for example, then it's fine to hide these controls as well, but they have to be just as findable. It's the important part to this. Jumping a little bit over the sections in the document that go on just web and documents, we'll go on to user preferences, which is section 11 under software, and this includes web. User interfaces following user preferences set in the system for color and contrast, font type and size, and focus color. So what this comes down to, if you've got an operating system or a browser where you configure your preferred colors, your preferred contrasts, font sizes, the websites or the apps that operate within that browser or within that operating system have to respect these settings. If the user says, I want this color, I want this font, I want this font size, those fonts have to be used. There's a little bit of an ongoing debate on whether or not that includes dark and light themes. Some monitoring agencies within Europe are testing for that, others are explicitly not. So that's a bit of an open question that I'm hoping can be resolved at some point in the near future. But that's essentially what this comes down to. And this really takes it well beyond what something like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have done in the past. It says, sure, allow users to control that, but it doesn't necessarily mean if those controls are already available. If somebody has a preference set, you need to reuse those preferences. So it really takes it far beyond what even the web guidelines currently say. Then one of my favorites, and maybe also one of the least developed ones, is on authoring tools. There is a short section on what authoring tools requirements are, but you can probably say a whole lot more about them. And the W3C has a whole specification written just about authoring tool guidelines. So if you haven't seen that, if you're not familiar with that, I would recommend you look that up. But authoring tools is a very broad category. It is essentially any tool that lets you create some piece of content. So this can be something as basic as a comment section on a website. If you're allowed to submit a review, or if you're allowed to contact an organization, those are authoring tools. But there are large systems that are authoring tools as well, such as a content management system, the kind of system where you create websites in. Those are authoring tools. Email clients, if you're writing and exchanging email, you're not just reading, you're writing emails, and those are authoring tools as well. Office software, your Words, your Excels, those are authoring tools. And then it's not just text either. Authoring tools can include video, it includes image editing software. So there's an awful lot of things that are authoring tools, but the requirement, what it comes down to, is authoring tools enable and guide the production of accessible content. So those two words there, enable and guide, are the key. Enable meaning it has to be possible to make things accessible with that tool, right? So it's not okay for you to have a tool that you cannot be used to create accessible content. And then guide, it's not just does it have to be possible, it has to help the user in doing so. It has to support the user in doing the right thing. That's required as part of this. It's really a broad requirement. Then that's my summary of what's going on in 301, 549. Again, there are a good deal more, but those were my favorites. But the European Accessibility Act itself has a number of accessibility requirements in it too, that I think are worth talking about as well. So this again is a summary of some of my favorites, but like really, I think these are very cool. And will really elevate accessibility beyond where it is today. Starting with product accessibility, and specifically product information. So product labels, including instructions, shall be available in an accessible format. If you're selling a thing and it has a little handbook in it, that handbook has to be accessible. If not the handbook itself, then you can provide an online version of that and make that accessible. But that's part of this. You're no longer allowed to just have documentation that nobody can use. Same for the labels on the products. The information has to be available in an accessible format. On top of that, there's a requirement about the accessibility features. Information on accessibility features shall be included in the product documentation. If you're creating a smartphone, then that smartphone has various accessibility features. Those have to be documented. And they have to be, as the previous requirement says, documented in an accessible format so that people can find out whether or not that product can be used by them. That goes both to the features that are required under the European Accessibility Act, but also to additional technologies. If you've done things to improve the accessibility beyond what the guidelines require, or beyond what the laws require, then those are accessibility features and those have to be documented as well. It doesn't even stop there, because if you're selling one of these products, which is required to have its accessibility features documented, you as the seller are required to provide that information. The accessibility features of a product have to be available. So what this enables for the consumer is a full path from before they buy to once they have a product in hand that gives them information on how accessible is this product, what additional things have they done to make this product accessible? Am I likely to want to use it? Or are there other similar products that maybe have better accessibility features for me so that I can make an informed choice about the products that I'm buying, the services that I'm buying? These are incredible leaps forward, and we've never had these kinds of legislations in the EU. Some other ones that I really enjoyed, because I don't know if you've noticed by now, I'm going off the list that I personally really liked, and I'm nerding out a little bit. Banking services are required to provide information in a B2 or lower reading level. If you're not familiar with reading levels, they go from A to C. C3, I think it goes up to. A B2 is, I don't know, I think it's a third grade reading level. In the US, it's a reading level that most adults will have mastered. It means banks, you're now required to make your information readable and understandable to people. Banking services isn't just limited to banks, it's mortgages too, it's money lending services, things providing services that banks do. So it's pretty broad, and it's such a fairly new and an exciting new development for reading levels. We've never had a reading level requirement adopted in so broad in this kind of way. As far as I'm aware, not anywhere in the world either. Next thing is transportation services. These transportation services need to provide information on the accessibility of their vehicle and infrastructure. So what accessibility features are on your train? How accessible are your train stations? How accessible are your airports? What support can be found on the buses that you might be traveling with? Much of this is done already in a good number of places in Europe, but a lot of it also isn't. So this is a really important and useful development for enabling people to travel independently. And then the last one I'll end up with, because I'm also running short on time a little bit, is audio visual media services. They're required to provide an accessible program guide. So if you're a TV station, you need to make sure that people know what's on when, and it needs to be in an accessible format. So this doesn't specify how you provide this. This can be a website, it can be an app, but whatever way you do that has to be accessible. So really nice developments in improving the accessibility of these different services. Moving on to my recommendations. So European Accessibility Act is a landmark development in accessibility. It sets a new standard. It sets requirements that are going to impact accessibility of people across the world, not just in Europe. My first thought there, if you haven't done this already, contact your lawyer. The EAA is going to apply to a lot of organizations, even if you're not based in Europe, even if you don't directly do business in Europe. EAA, it can impact you. Second is check what applies. So this isn't just websites. As I talked about, EAA is very broad. It applies very broadly to lots of different electronics and communications technologies. And it isn't limited to the products and services itself either. There's the documentation that's around it needs to be accessible. The terminals for such as self-service terminals for obtaining products and services need to be accessible. Help desk services need to be accessible. So it's the whole package. It is not just a single aspect that you need to start thinking about. And then do your testing. Even if you've done WCAG testing for years, which good on you if you've done that. EN 31549 and European Accessibility Act add a good layer of new accessibility requirements that need to be tested for. So get on that. Figure out where you are because the deadline is really not that far away. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is check your suppliers. You're not just responsible for the things that you produce. If you're buying things and then selling them onto the consumer markets, you're responsible for that as well. You're responsible for checking that the people you bought it from made sure this complies. It doesn't just stop at, oh, I didn't know, or oh, it's not me, I didn't make this. That's not how it goes. The European Accessibility Act applies across the board. And that's what I had for everybody today. And thank you very much for your time and for listening to me. And let's see if there's some questions. I imagine there might be.
Well,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you very much, Wilco. That was a really good talk. I enjoyed it very much. And I want to know, Bruce, do you have any questions for Wilco?
We have questions, and I'm keeping a firm eye on the time, Kathleen, don't worry. So, Wilco, does the scope of EAA apply to tools provided to the workforce or only to consumers?
EAA is for the consumer markets. So it might not directly apply. I would think very often there are ways in which these tools do end up on a consumer market. So there's a good chance that in some indirect way it does, but to my knowledge, I do not believe it does.
So, to your knowledge, it's for consumers rather than to the workforce.
Yes, it is not a business to business directive. No.
Gotcha. And the same question I asked, can you describe what falls under the umbrella of e-commerce services? This is a big, big question. I'm sorry.
That is a big question, and that is a tough one. I am not an expert on exactly those definitions.
Mhm.
I'm an accessibility specialist, and that very much gets into legal territory. So I would, instead of listening to me about that, I would ask a lawyer to make sure.
You'll take the fifth, as I believe they would have said in this. I know I'm not a lawyer either. Does it apply? You mentioned things that you buy or things that you sell. Does it only apply to things that actually have a financial transaction?
No, no, when it comes to services, it applies when there's a contract. So contracts don't necessarily need to be in a financial exchange, but there is some kind of contracts to offer a service that is part of it. So, and that's where those details in what exactly does that mean? When is it a contract? What is, and that's where the e-commerce definition gets tricky.
Mhm. Contact your lawyer. This could actually be a good time to quickly train as a lawyer.
I have too much fun doing accessibility. I'm sorry.
Another question. I know that EN 301549 is being revised to support WCAG 2.2 and is expected to come out in May, June 2005. What's the expected enforcement date?
I don't think that's known yet. I've certainly heard that direction June 2025 as well. I don't know that's confirmed. For sure there's going to be a transition period in that. But what that is as far as I'm aware, is still to be determined. I don't think anybody knows. Just hasn't been decided yet.
Gotcha. Now, this following one is a question from me, so it might actually be completely missing the
I
point.
hope I can answer this one.
I,
I don't feel like I'm doing so good
I,
at this.
I might be missing the point because my daughter brought her useless dog round for me to dog sit, and it demanded going outside for a pee, so I did miss a bit. If EN 301549 future proofs it bakes 2.2 WCAG 2.2 into the law, will it be therefore baked in the law forever? And then when WCAG 3 comes out, there will be a sort of legal conflict, or will
Oh boy.
I didn't express that terribly well,
No,
but
probably not. So 301549 isn't the law. 301549 is a European standard. And what the European Accessibility Act does is it says the accessibility, the standards for accessibility are in the EU Register for Standards. So there's a list of standards that the EU has accepted, and 31549 is part of that. And a new version can be published to that. So 31549, as was already mentioned, is being updated. So the standard can change over time. So
right, so
presumably, as soon as WCAG 3 is ready, if ever, hopefully, it can be incorporated in 31549.
gotcha. So the law says you have to follow the standard, and the standard says at the moment it's WCAG 2.2, but that can change.
It's 2.1. It's 2.1, but actually, really, it's EN 301549, which includes 2.1 level A and AA. But it's not just WCAG 2.1. That is the important point here too. It is not just WCAG. It's beyond WCAG. There's more to it.
You successfully convinced me that I would not be a good lawyer, so I'm not going to run out and I will immediately retain an advocate. Last question from me before we let you go home or wherever you're going. Are the slides available to people who are listening today?
I haven't done that, but if I can send them to you, I'm guessing if I can send them to the ID24, I'm guessing they can share them as well, right? So I will make sure that happens. I'll do that right after.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. There was a lot of information there. But I consider myself until recently an accessibility professional, and I didn't know half of it. So
well, I'm glad to bring something new. That's why I did this.
Really appreciate it. Wilco Fiers, folks.
Thank you so much.
Kathleen, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks again, Wilco. It was a pleasure having you on the show. So everyone, if you liked this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop on any of our future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you thanks to our sponsors and our supporters, and that includes Barrier Break, Infotopia, Infoaxia, Tetralogical, Intuit, Adrian Roselli LLC, Assistive Labs, the Law Office of Lainey Feingold, Skyscanner, and Vispero. Inclusive Design will be back on the hour with our next session. See you then.